I want to start by giving you just a brief overview of the Kefauver Committee's origins, its responsibilities, what I see as some of its limits in order to set up the rest of my talk. I assume some of you are very familiar with it already, but for the benefit of anyone who might not be. The Kefauver Committee, the formal name, as Richard told you just now, was the Senate Special Committee to Investigate Organized Crime in Interstate Commerce. The Kefauver Committee was empowered to investigate the use of the facilities of interstate commerce by organized crime syndicates nationwide. They were especially interested in gambling operations. That's what Kefauver thought was really I believe he called it the lifeblood of the mob. The resolution proposing the creation of the committee was introduced by Senator Kefauver of Tennessee in January of 1950 and approved by the Senate in May. Over the next 15 months, a 5-man committee conducted hearings in 14 major cities around the country. The public took a very keen interest in the work of this particular committee. Some of the hearings were televised. We were just talking about this a few moments ago. And an estimated audience of about 30 million people tuned in to watch, many of them not from their living rooms. Most people didn't have televisions in those days, but the local movie theaters were showing the talk. So read wonderful stories about women pushing their baby carriages around New York City, and when the kid would fall asleep, they would duck into the theater so that they could watch a few minutes of it. And it was fascinating to them to see Kefauver and his colleagues questioning infamous mob bosses and their associates, as well as some very prominent politicians whom they suspected of having ties to organized crime. The committee's final report was issued in 1951, and it concluded that organized crime syndicates really did exist, were not myths, and that they depended upon the support and the cooperation of public officials around the country. Public interest in organized crime had deep roots already, but at the end of the Second World War, there was a great resurgence of interest in and deep concern about organized crime in the United States. The FBI had long downplayed the existence of the mob, and the public and the media had paid, they hadn't ignored it exactly, but they had certainly paid less sustained attention to organized crime since the last of the high-profile Prohibition-era gangsters either died or went to prison in the 1930s. Now, there are a number of reasons that scholars have bantered about for this renewed interest. I'm going to run through a few of them very briefly, but these are the ones that have some direct bearing on my research, what I'll talk to you about here in just a second. There are 4 big ones that I think relate here. One is that in some cities, there certainly was the perception that mob violence had increased. People sometimes mistakenly argue that the Kefauver Committee came about in the first place because of a particular murder of a kingpin in Kansas City in the spring of 1950. The committee was actually already in the works at that point, but that was a very timely event, came at a time when people were already becoming more aware of and more worried about organized crime, and it certainly helped Kefauver. It helped to underscore the need for federal action. Another reason we already know a lot about is that labor racketeering was undermining some powerful unions in the country during and after the war, when industrial output was obviously a paramount concern. But the 2 that have the most bearing on my project are, one, that it was becoming more clear to people that racketeers had corrupted the political process in cities where they had thrived more or less unchecked for decades. That lull between the 30s and the 50s, when we weren't paying as close attention to what they were doing, was a period of tremendous growth for organized crime operations, particularly in the South. And then finally, I think the onset of the Cold War contributed as well. In an atmosphere of heightened anxiety about corrupt officials, espionage, blackmail, any immoral or extralegal activities were subjected to greater scrutiny. And in this environment, it makes sense that any perceptions of political corruption seemed especially dangerous. So that's the kind of what's happening on the national level. I'm focusing on this story, the history of organized crime, in a place called Phoenix City. That's the wickedest city in America. You've probably never heard of it. Some of you haven't. The map here gives you an idea of roughly where it is. My book examines organized crime and government corruption between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the Cold War. It tells the story of how Phoenix City, Alabama, the small city on the Chattahoochee River, just across the river from Columbus, Georgia, if you know where that is, you can literally walk across the bridge into Phoenix City, how it became the headquarters of an organized crime ring following the Civil War. After Fort Benning was established across the river in Columbus in 1918, the racketeers had a steady stream of revenue from soldiers on payday. They really constituted the most reliable source of income for the rackets. By the 1930s, the syndicate ran the city, and it did so with the cooperation and the blessing of local officials. It was a dry county, but they ran saloons out in the open, they ran brothels, all kinds of gambling rackets, from numerous lotteries and slot machines that were rigged to never pay out. Slot machines were in casinos and gambling halls and clubs, but they were also in the drugstore. There was a grocery store that people joked that you could not find a loaf of bread anywhere in that grocery store, but that was the front. There were milk crates set up. I've talked to a couple of people who remember going in and playing the penny slots when they were little. There were little milk crates there so that kids could reach them and play if they wanted to. But they also ran some fancier establishments, big casinos for high rollers who came into Phoenix City specifically to visit those places. By the early 1950s, when the Kefauver Committee was investigating the extent of organized crime nationwide, the mob in Phoenix City was running a pretty sophisticated enterprise, one that by some estimates generated $100 million a year and enabled racketeers to control local and state politics. But the mob's wealth and power also depended upon more nefarious businesses in Phoenix City. I won't talk about this too much today, but just by way of explanation, this is one of the things that my larger project is looking at. Central to the rise of organized crime in Phoenix City, and at least by the 1930s elsewhere in the South as well, was the growing power of the mob to control, exchange, and profit from the sale of women's and children's bodies. Prostitution, including involving women sometimes or children, sometimes as young as 12 or 13 years old, was rampant. So were illegal adoptions, especially involving the children of single or poor mothers. These were extensive operations that enriched the racketeers in Phoenix City, but also linked them to criminal networks outside of Alabama and outside of the South. The most striking thing about the Phoenix City mob, though, was the extent of its political connections. The mob there exercised complete control over municipal government and local law enforcement, but it also exercised tremendous influence in state politics. Local citizens had made a few attempts to clean up the mob in the early part of the 20th century. They got nowhere with those efforts. That didn't change until the late 1940s, when a stronger crime-fighting organization, a group of local citizens, was organized. It was called the Russell Betterment Association. Phoenix City is in Russell County, Alabama. And its members became targets of mob violence right away. I think that's a pretty good testament to how threatened they felt by this new organization. In 1952, they bombed the home of one of the leaders of the Russell Betterment Association. They set fire to the law office of another one. And in June of 1954, when the mob's efforts to rig the Democratic primary to prevent a local crime-fighting attorney, the same one whose office they burned, to prevent him, his name was Albert Patterson, from becoming the state's new attorney general failed. He won the Democratic primary in spite of their efforts. They assassinated him outside of his law office in downtown Phoenix City. Local officials and law enforcement were so corrupted that the governor had to declare martial law in order to sort out the mess. And when the dust settled the next year, the nation was shocked to learn that the three people suspected of his murder were prominent public officials: the deputy sheriff, a man named Albert Fuller, the circuit solicitor, a man named Arch Farrell, and the sitting attorney general for the state of Alabama, whose name was Silas Garrett. Shortly after the murder, Garrett checked himself into a mental hospital in Texas and avoided being prosecuted. Only Fuller and Farrell stood trial, and only Fuller ever went to prison, and not for very long. He ended up getting out and moving back to Phoenix City, where he was taken care of by his former associates for the rest of his days. This story made national and international headlines. A local newspaper even won a Pulitzer Prize for its coverage of the case. But it was no surprise to the people of Phoenix City, who had been pleading with state and federal agencies for help for decades. They had appealed, in fact, to Estes Kefauver and his colleagues on the Senate Committee to investigate organized crime. The high point of tensions in Phoenix City overlapped with the work of the Kefauver Committee. Indeed, Senator Kefauver and Albert Patterson, the man who was murdered by the mob, were pretty good acquaintances and exchanged a lot of letters and back and forth advice about how best to deal with this problem. So I came here a couple of years ago for the first time looking at these collections in hopes of learning more about that correspondence, specifically about that relationship. I'd seen a few letters in Albert Patterson's papers at the State Archives in Alabama, and I wondered how much information he had given the Kefauver Committee. But in looking through that correspondence, I didn't actually find very much between those two here. I, in fact, have learned a lot more about the national dimensions of my study of organized crime and political corruption in the Jim Crow South. Now, my project is still very much a work in progress. As Richard said, I'm starting to write it up next year when I finally mercifully have a little bit of leave time from teaching and committee work. And so I can't outline precisely how all of this fits into the book, but I do want to focus on some of the most important things that I've taken away from my research here and try to explain what I think it has to do with my larger project. The first big takeaway from this work is that the Kefauver Committee's work wasn't entirely new. It was the first effort by Congress to investigate organized crime, but it mirrored and it relied very heavily upon the work of existing anti-vice and local crime commissions. And evaluating the work of those committees, I've learned, is as well as the aid that they gave to the Kefauver Committee, is absolutely essential in understanding the full scope of the Senate Committee's work. And also the limits of that work. Now, a lot of cities had had anti-vice commissions before. There were many back in the early 20th century during the Progressive era, but the ones that Kefauver and his colleagues were communicating with in 1950 and 1951 were relatively new. Most were organized in the mid to late 1940s. So when the Kefauver Committee came around in 1950, dozens and dozens of local anti-crime commissions were already engaged in the same work, collecting up-to-date data on local criminal enterprises in order to measure the full scope of their activities and their influence, networking with other anti-vice groups to find better ways of addressing local problems, and perhaps most importantly, even a few years before the Kefauver Committee put the national spotlight on organized crime by broadcasting to the entire nation what they were up to, these groups were publicizing the work of local criminal operations in an effort to paralyze them. One example I've already mentioned was the Russell Betterment Association in Phoenix City, founded in the late 1940s. Now, one thing I learned from looking through the Kefauver records is that the Russell Betterment Association was a little bit unusual in that it came out of a small town. Most of the ones that existed, perhaps not surprisingly, were in larger towns and cities. Brought a couple of images of the kinds of literature they would put out. I know this is a little difficult to see back there. It looks kind of dark. But Miami had one called the Greater Crime Commission, or the Crime Commission, rather, of Greater Miami. It was founded in 1948. And one of the things that was interesting about the correspondence between some of the members of this committee and the Kefauver Committee is that I realized how much they were up against funding challenges. Unlike the Kefauver Committee that had a grant from Congress to do their work, these were locally organized. They did not receive any public funding whatsoever. They may have had public officials on their members roster, but they weren't getting any funding. And in fact, one of the things they complained about most to Kefauver was how they spent most of their time not actually doing data collection, not in the way they wanted to, or coming up with real solutions to the problems that the city was facing, but they spent a lot of time trying to raise money so that they could do those things. They also did collect a lot of data anyway, though, and they communicated that to Kefauver. Another example, and I really like their literature, was the commission in Kansas City. They had a really good graphic design person. This I won't flip through all of it, but I have a couple of images here. I'm sorry these are so small and difficult to see. I had them blown up, but their literature, as you can see here, tended to focus more on how crime cost the city money. They thought it was an effective way to get people to step in and do something about it. Not to make arguments about morality and what's wrong with what they're doing, but to say, you know, whether you like it or not. We're not, you know, asking who's participated in this. We're not interested in that. They were really concerned about how much money it was costing the city to deal with these problems created by organized crime. As I said, these are typical anti-crime commissions that Kefauver and his colleagues were corresponding with. And it would make sense that where there were bigger populations and more money to support this work, they would be more effective and thrive a little bit more. So it helps to explain why something like the Russell Betterment Association was a little more unusual. Nevertheless, these commissions were absolutely instrumental in filling in Kefauver and his colleagues on the full scope of organized crime activities in the United States. And while the committee correspondence suggests that commissions like the Russell Betterment Association were really the exception, the committee's correspondence does shed some light on the work of the Russell Betterment Association. The files contain dozens of letters like this one from a man named John Luttrell in Phoenix City, complaining about the pervasiveness of organized crime. He was a member of the Russell Betterment Association. He calls it the Citizens Committee in this letter, but it's pretty clear that's who he's talking about. And he appeals to Kefauver, as many of his friends and colleagues on the Russell Betterment Association did, to understand that the Phoenix City racketeers were not just a local concern, and they should not just be seen as a local concern. He alludes to the mob's ties to state government and to its suspected involvement in criminal enterprises in Florida. And he makes clear that he believes there's a connection between the Cold War objectives of the federal government and those of the Russell Betterment Association. Near the bottom of the letter, he says, while we are fighting for democracy in other countries of the world, please help us root out those people who seek to buy our own government. And to document his claims, Luttrell included a local newspaper clipping. This one I found particularly interesting because it's about one of the mob guys was getting a divorce, and his wife just put him on blast to the local newspapers and just let them know everything that he was up to. So she was probably one of the better sources of information they could have had. Interestingly enough, I later figured out that her parents were the ones who were running the illegal adoption ring. Her father was a doctor and her mother was his nurse. I'm not going to go, we can talk about that at the end here. It's probably the most salacious bit of information I have about what the mob was doing, and one that I thought was not true until I found some documentation of it. I thought it was just one of those legends that had been based on some grain of truth that had been grossly exaggerated, but it's not. It was actually true. Now, he included the clippings with most of his letters, and a lot of the correspondents did this. I think, in an effort to convince him that this was well known, that they're not just sort of spreading rumors about their neighbors, that this is a real problem, and it's one that the committee needed to address. Kefauver wrote back to Luttrell. He tended to write back to the majority of people who were writing these letters outlining their concerns, usually with a more brief response than this, and I know it's difficult to read from back there, but this one is interesting because his reply is a little bit less firm of a no than he would be giving to people later on. He simply tells them that time won't permit them to come to every place, but every small town where there might be some problems, but he indicates that he's interested in learning more about what's going on in Phoenix City. Now, unbeknownst to Luttrell, probably he was already corresponding with Albert Patterson, and Kefauver knew very well what was going on in Phoenix City, and I do think he took a special interest in those letters. And elsewhere, there's some other correspondence like this, but there are little memos like this scattered throughout the papers. There's a memo, I guess, either saying that Hugh Bentley had called or somebody had called and mentioned Hugh Bentley's name. He's the guy whose house was firebombed by the mob. And below it, you see the name of Hoyt Shepard. Hoyt Shepard was the main kingpin in Phoenix City. and the guy working for him who bombed the house, his name was Tommy Dynamite Caps. Each person had a specialty. There was the safe cracker, and you didn't step on the safe cracker's territory. Tommy Dynamite Caps, I wish I had his mugshot. I do have a copy of it from the State Archives. It's interesting, and his long list of known activities. But he was their guy they called in to blow things up. And there are a lot of snippets of information like this scattered throughout, so I really got the impression that a lot of people were corresponding with Kefauver and that he knew a great deal about what's going on in Phoenix City. Now, these people writing these letters and the crime commissions as well that they were members of were some of Kefauver's best sources of information. In fact, he often contacted the leaders of some of these crime commissions himself in order to solicit information. And when there were no commissions to turn to, he wrote instead to sometimes the local law enforcement. I think he figured out that wasn't going to get him very far in Phoenix City. So instead he would write to local journalists asking for if they would share with him any data that they collected in working on some of their stories. Found a great one from a Birmingham reporter named Gene Wartzman. He was writing about Birmingham and other problems in Alabama, but Wartzman also knew a great deal about Phoenix City. He was one of 2 or 3 journalists who wrote a number of stories about Phoenix City, and he and a man named Ed Strickland later wrote a book following the Patterson murder about the years of activities of the mob in Phoenix City. Now, I'm hoping to over the next few months, dig a little deeper into the work of some of these commissions now that I see how important their work was to Kefauver. I'm interested in particular in whether or not they were also policing other quote-unquote criminal behaviors. I think that if the Kefauver Committee and this constellation of municipal anti-crime commissions were responses to post-war fears about crime and political corruption, then it stands to reason they may have supported other law and order initiatives not directly related to organized crime. It's impossible to fully disentangle genuine concerns about organized crime syndicates from Cold War era fears about all kinds of other supposedly immoral behaviors. And we know that Kefauver had a keen interest in some of these other behaviors too. He was an ardent supporter of legislation to limit pornography. He headed another committee later on, and even during this time was very interested in juvenile delinquency. And some of these commissions, these local commissions, had initiatives, and in one of them, I can't remember if it's Kansas City or Miami, they specifically mentioned that they are concerned with juvenile delinquency and how that might feed local organized crime activities. So they were doing things like trying to ban violent comic books or encourage parents to not let their kids go see violent films and those kinds of things. Now, the details about this are something that the Kefauver Committee records don't clarify for me, but it has made me interested in looking at some of these local commissions to see if they were, how much they were corresponding with smaller groups like the Russell Betterman Association. It's really difficult to find the records of some of these local groups. And so the Kefauver Committee records constitute some of the only documentation that we have of some of these organizations, and they're really fascinating. I also think that one of the things that's come out of my looking at the correspondence with these anti-crime groups and their members is an awareness of the shortcomings of these anti-crime campaigns, because they don't really give the full measure of local involvement in and sometimes local support for, or at least local tolerance for the rackets before things became openly violent or just something happened that made people think, now this really has to stop. It doesn't indicate anywhere in these records, from listening to some of these committees talk, that the men in these smaller towns and cities in particular were prominent local citizens. They were members of the JCs. The guy who shot Albert Patterson, a few years before that, he had been up for JC of the Year. And I'm told by a local, somebody who knew him, didn't know him directly, but knew someone who knew him, that he was really embittered that he didn't win. They were Little League coaches. They were deacons in the local churches. They were donors to local organizations. The high school band in Phoenix City needed new band uniforms. So one of the racketeers bought them. The county needed to build a new hospital. The one they had was hopelessly outdated, and one of the racketeers donated the land. And then they said, well, wonderful, thank you. We don't have enough money to build the hospital, so they gave them some money to build the hospital as well. Their full measure was as prominent citizens in their communities, not as embarrassments or criminals. I don't think there are a lot of devils or saints in this story, but to look at the anti-crime campaign, sometimes that's what you would be led to believe. Just one more anecdote, and I'll move on to the next one, but Albert Patterson himself, the man who was murdered by the mob, he was a local attorney. He had done work for them in the past. In fact, he defended one of the main kingpins in a murder trial a few years before his own murder. Now, he in no way was sympathetic to them. They tried to buy him off many times, and he wouldn't do it. But it certainly suggests that for many years, like most of his neighbors, he was more tolerant of their behavior. And he really only turned against them and they against him when he joined the Russell Betterment Association and developed political aspirations of his own and wanted to run for office. And of course, Kefauver was very politically ambitious as well. And they all reveled in this reputation for being tough on crime. My second sort of big takeaway from my work in these records, and this one is pretty closely related to the first, is that the Kefauver investigation, as we know, revealed that organized crime was best known as an urban affliction, one concentrated in major cities in the North and the West. New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Las Vegas, the very places where the Kefauver Committee conducted hearings. If the Kefauver Committee's public activities confirmed what most people already knew, that organized crime was real and that the syndicates were running loose in some of the nation's biggest cities, the records of the committee show that organized crime flourished in smaller cities and towns across the country, where racketeers and corrupted public officials exercised control over municipal politics, local law enforcement, local businesses, and sometimes state politics as well. Presumably, the committee assumed, when they received some of these letters from people complaining about local problems, that crime syndicates in smaller towns and cities were not only less common, but they were smaller and probably less likely to be engaged in interstate business. But Kefauver's correspondence told him otherwise. Now, he certainly knew that Phoenix City, sitting on a state boundary, was engaged in interstate commerce, but his correspondence told him time and again that this was so. This letter is very generic, but I really love it because this person is very impassioned. It cut off her signature there, but this is a lady named Wanda from Alabama who wrote this pleading letter to Kefauver saying that the South was in trouble, that this has been going on for a long time, the situation is dire. She does not offer a lot of detail, but it's she's obviously very upset about whatever it is that she knows. Most of the letters he received, though, were very specific. They named names, they had dates, they had specific information about what was going on and where and when. The correspondence files are organized by state, and you can just scan the boxes and look and see that the southern states are full. They're thick files of letters from people detailing these kinds of activities. And over again, people are making the same kinds of complaints about their local problems. These are local problems, but they would always say they are linked to problems in other cities, other states, other parts of the country. They know the Kefauver Committee is looking at interstate commerce. They know that they've got to get his attention too. So they really tended to highlight that. And as I mentioned earlier, they would often include newspaper clippings to document their claims, to say, I'm not just pulling this out of thin air. This really is happening, and we know that it's happening around here. There were many, many people writing with complaints about Phoenix City too. But there are also letters from places like Birmingham, Muscle Shoals, Gadsden, Alabama, Colbert, Georgia, Savannah, Georgia, Seneca, South Carolina, Chattanooga, Tennessee, Port Arthur, Texas, Galveston, Texas. I could go on and on and on. And the queries were all very similar. Dear Senator, they began, and then each letter outlined complaints about illegal gambling, prostitution, and intimidation, sometimes violent intimidation, by a small group of racketeers and their employees. But the men and women who wrote these letters also linked those activities to the things I mentioned earlier, to political corruption, to labor racketeering, or to just meddling in whatever the local business was, and to Cold War security concerns. One person in Muscle Shoals wrote a letter to Kefauver saying that he was certain that communists were running the mob in Muscle Shoals. Another person, this person called himself or herself an American, wrote this rather odd and paranoid sounding note to the committee saying that communism was the brother of the black market. Another man wrote a letter to Kefauver calling racketeers parasites and saying that he thought they were an even bigger threat to democracy than communism was. A number of people in Phoenix City were saying that to him as well. This is a huge problem. We're not really too concerned about what's going on in the Cold War. We see that as a problem, but the real war is right here in Phoenix City. Now the accusations, as this one sort of indicates, and I know it probably is difficult to read it there, but I'll leave it up so you can scan it for people with good eyesight. Sometimes the accusations were so outrageous that Kefauver and his colleagues didn't pay much attention to them. A few of them, I thought I had an image of one and I couldn't pull it up. Somebody had written in the margins, this is a crackpot. And some of them were. There were also letters from people who seemed to have personal vendettas against certain local officials. So they would write to him and say, John Doe is into this and you need to come and get him, and hoping that Kefauver would come and investigate him. So some of it, whether it was true or not, there was some other motive behind it. But I was struck by, I thought there'd be more of that in the papers, and there certainly is a good deal of it, but it's obvious that they were also receiving a lot of really good information, detailed information. Information, as I said earlier, that sometimes people volunteered, and sometimes Kefauver solicited from people that he trusted. Now, in terms of the outcome of this campaign and its bearing on my research into Phoenix City, I think that certainly the committee's conclusions in their final report in 1951 were no surprise to those thousands of citizens who were writing him letters in 1950 and 1951. But the committee's work also didn't lead to what they wanted, which was a serious crackdown on organized crime, either in the big cities where the hearings were held, or in the small towns like Phoenix City, whose citizens pleaded mostly in vain for any kind of attention from the committee or any sort of help, because they could not rely on corrupted officials at the local and state levels to help them out. In Phoenix City, despite the work of the Russell Betterment Association, the mob thrived in the early 1950s, and for years after the Kefauver Committee suspended its investigation. Local elected officials, local law enforcement, and the state attorney general facilitated the work of the racketeers there. It really didn't end until they overstepped in 1954 when they killed Albert Patterson and the governor declared martial law. That was really the only way to root it out. Interestingly, most of the people who were involved in the mob, the ones who didn't go to jail, and most of them didn't serve any real time, they were from Phoenix City. They stopped maybe operating their saloons and brothels, but when the dust settled, they all stayed in Phoenix City. And they continued serving as JCs, they continued coaching Little League and going to local political banquets and serving as deacons in their churches. This is what they always had been. They were citizens who were well integrated into the local community, and they stayed there afterwards. But of course, organized crime didn't end there in the South. And this is beyond the scope of my work, but most of you are probably familiar with some of the other more high-profile cases in the 1960s. Like the murder of Fuzzy Horde in Jackson County, Georgia, Buford Pusser's campaign in McNairy County, Tennessee, and a lot of very high-profile cases along the Gulf Coast from the 1960s, even well into the 1980s. My big questions, and the ones that I still am working through, when I came here to start my research, my big questions were, why haven't we focused on the South? Why didn't Kefauver pay attention to all these people? And what would a closer look at organized crime activities in the South really tell us? Why do we need to know? Well, the records don't offer any easy answers to that first question. But they do show that there was overwhelming evidence that organized crime thrived in the South and that it had corrupted local and even state politics by 1950, and that everybody knew about this. This was no secret. The rich correspondence files also outline the extensive, diversified, and sophisticated work of crime syndicates in the South for decades before the 1950s. They provide some of the best documentation that we have, city by city and state by state, of the full scope of organized crime in the South in the first half of the 20th century. Now, as for the second question about what this can teach us about the South, I think a number of big things that I'm still working through. But one of the things that the Kefauver Committee's response to some of these letters got me thinking more about was that, like most citizens, they had the assumption that that this was an urban problem, and these preconceived ideas about what constitutes a real urban space, too. It made me realize that in some ways this project is engaging questions that I worked on a little bit in my first book that did not have as sexy a title as you heard earlier. It's about a highway, but about connections between urban and rural communities. Because Phoenix City was a very important market town for farmers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but it was also a way station for the very same kinds of vice and danger and depravity that Southerners in that time associated with bigger cities, more industrialized cities. And Phoenix City, what was happening in Phoenix City challenged ideas about the safety and security of small town life, even as industry and big agribusiness took over as drivers of the national and regional economy. Anxieties about that transition, along with challenges to the racial and sexual status quo that were magnified by the mob's activities, were projected onto attitudes about the state's regulatory responsibilities, which they increasingly believed meant that they needed to define and punish criminal behavior. As Phoenix City, along with the rest of the South, shifted away from an agricultural society to a more urban and industrialized one, it embodied larger and increasingly fraught regional fluctuations and negotiations between citizens and the state. By the late 1940s, when the imperatives of Cold War policymaking reshaped ideas about safety and security in more global contexts, citizens' heightened responses to the presence of organized crime reflected their growing anxieties about global and also local threats to their safety and to the economic order. Another sort of big takeaway from this, a big question I'm thinking about in terms of what this tells us about the Jim Crow South, is that the correspondence files for me really confirmed how common it was for citizens to link their fears about organized crime to their fears about safety and security after the war. As the Phoenix City case played out, Cold War paranoia was making its way into American homes, where people wanted to think they could still retain some measure of personal safety and control over their own lives. The Patterson murder in Phoenix City shattered these illusions for people, for white Southerners in particular, right? The moral degradation of their communities by decades of vice had been bad enough, they thought, but the cold-blooded murder of a prominent elected official prompted outrage. There's a wonderful quote from, I believe one of the local papers carried it, but from someone near Phoenix City shortly after the Patterson murder, who said, you know, political assassinations, those things are supposed to happen in Latin American dictatorships and Eastern European provinces, but not in Alabama. That doesn't happen here. And I think it spoke volumes about how rattled people were that this was going on there. They knew it was going on, but they just didn't think it was going to go quite that far. At the heart of this book, ultimately, I think are a lot of long overlooked connections between white Southerners' resistance to civil rights and the backlash against organized crime as the foundation of post-war conservatism. And I'm really interested in the ways in which, I can put criminal in scare quotes, but a criminal subculture, whose definition I think was constantly in flux, especially as ambitious politicians started getting involved in it and sort of casting themselves as being tough on crime. That these ideas about a criminal subculture coexisted for so long alongside reactionary ideas about race and gender and the role of the state. In practice, the Southern commitment to law and order, I think, masked widespread corruption for decades, in much the same way that myths about racial purity and sexual morality had for so long obscured a range of sex crimes, including widespread prostitution of underage girls, 12 and 13-year-old girls in Phoenix City. Those are documented cases. And the unprosecuted rapes and sexual assaults of black women by white men. Just to wrap up, I guess, my sort of summation of the committee and what it teaches us here is that I think that most of our popular knowledge about organized crime comes from what we know, thanks to the work of the Kefauver Committee. But I think the limits of the committee's work have shaped what we know as well. The correspondence files in the committee's records are incredibly extensive and rich sources of information that reveal that Southerners were deeply interested in the work of the committee and that they worked tirelessly to get the committee's attention. And while the committee didn't conduct a serious investigation in any Deep South city except for New Orleans, its correspondence files document a very active and extensive network of organized crime activities in the post-war South. Activities that had gone unchecked for decades, and unfortunately, for Phoenix City, would continue far beyond the lifespan of the Kefauver Committee as well. Thank you.
Chris is always the first to ask.
Thank you very much. Do you have a sense from your research of how independent Kefauver could be as a senator in the Senate that contained so many very powerful Southern senators? Did they put up any pressure against his exploring these links in the South?
Not that I've seen, certainly not from my research into the records. That's beyond the scope of what I'm working on, so I haven't looked into it too much. But nothing that I've read and there is some correspondence in there back and forth between some of his colleagues, but it's nothing that I've seen there or in any personal papers would indicate that there was any serious pushback. I mean, in a way, this is not a difficult thing to support either, right? This committee's work, I mean, I know there was some wrangling over who was going to run the committee and what sort of where the funding was going to come from, and it ends up being a special committee and not tied to an existing committee because of that. But beyond that, I mean, I think everybody wanted a little bit of credit for it probably, so. But beyond that, I think the work that the committee was doing was an easy thing to support. So not to say that there wasn't any whatsoever, I'm sure there was, but I haven't come across anything that I could speak to specifically about that. If anybody knows if there is, I would love to know that, who was going after him.
I think maybe I have a misconception. When I hear the mob, I think mafia. So I'm wondering what you might comment on demographics of the mobs you've looked at.
Yeah, that's a great question, thank you. And people have asked me that a number of times. I think that it's not a misconception necessarily, that's what we think of when we think about the mob. And it's just as I said, we think about organized crime and the mob, we think about urban areas, we think of the mafia. In the South, as far as I've been able to tell, definitely not in Phoenix City, but not in any other iterations of mob or racketeer activity in the South, was there any particular ethnic orientation, or there's not anything that's sort of tying people together other than the fact that they are interested in these kinds of activities. It was the people who were running it were a relatively small, but very well organized group of people. In Phoenix City, there was the guy Hoyt Shepard I mentioned, he was really the sort of big kingpin. But there were a couple of other people who were considered kind of bosses or kingpins, and they used that terminology to talk about them. But most of the people working for them were just, sort of petty criminals who had, like Tommy Capps, who had proven himself to be adept with dynamite, who were useful to them. There was another guy named Clarence Revel, who was a ran a safe-cracking school in Phoenix City. They had a building where they actually would bring people in who showed talent for safe cracking, and they taught them how to do it. So when I say that it was a sophisticated organization, I sometimes jokingly call it disorganized crime in Phoenix City, but really it was actually quite organized. But everybody was very specialized, and it was very carefully set up. But it wasn't. There were not that I can figure out so far. I've not found any credible links between the Italian mafia in New York or a group in Chicago or something, or the Irish mob and the racketeers in Phoenix City.
So within the mob in Phoenix City, it was diverse demographically?
It was all white men, I mean,
Well,
yeah.
But
But
as
yeah.
far as ethnic backgrounds? or-
Yeah, no, I mean, no, and most of them were from Phoenix City or from nearby. So there were a few people who came in from the outside. There was one, actually, I was going to say there was one guy who was not born in the United States, but that's not true. I think his parents were immigrants, but they had come to Alabama, and he was born there. But they called him the Englishman because they thought of him as being, having this very different kind of background from them. But most of them were locals or had been there for a very long time, so people had forgotten where they moved there from. Phoenix City, interestingly, it had this reputation for a really long time, dating back to even the early 19th century. Even before Alabama became a state, people would run, if they were running from the law in Georgia, achieved statehood before Alabama did, they would run into Alabama to get away. And the area that became Phoenix City, it had a number of different names, but I was amused to learn that at some point in the early 19th century, its formal name was Sodom. They called it Sodom. That was the name of the community. But so it kind of had this reputation for a long time, but I think that it would be unfair to say that there was anything approaching a real organized racketeering operation until a little bit in the 19-teens and 20s when the state passed when the state passed a prohibition law and they were openly flouting it. The state attorney general came in and put the sheriff on trial because he was refusing to enforce the law, and they kicked him out. They replaced him, and a couple of years later, when election season came around, the people of Phoenix City re-elected that same guy. And then in the 1930s, the city started selling licenses to raise revenues. The city was broke. So that's one of the reasons that it really flourished there in the city. When I said they actively cooperated, they really did. They sold licenses and looked the other way at a lot of legal violations in order to keep revenues up.
You reference the Jim Crow South, and I was wondering what was it about the fact that it was Jim Crow and the relationship, or was there an impact on the unorganized crime because it was Jim Crow?
This is one of the big sort of questions that I alluded to at the end of the talk that I'm sorting through here. I don't have a clean answer to that, but I can tell you a few things about it. I guess one of my overarching concerns about this going into this project was, what did it mean, or how did it affect race relations in Phoenix City and Alabama when you have this all-powerful white mob? I'm calling it the mob. They called themselves, or people called it the mob there. They didn't call themselves that. But what did that mean for race relations? From what I have learned about Phoenix City, the way that race played into the mob's activities, it didn't quite work the way that I thought it would. I thought there would be more tensions. There really weren't more tensions necessarily. The mob had absolute control over the city and city government. The gambling establishments in Phoenix City were segregated like everything else. But a lot of African Americans were employed by the mob in Phoenix City. And even though the the black establishments were white owned, they put African Americans in charge of running those clubs. I also wondered about political involvement of the mob and who were they supporting and what kinds of things. As far as I have been able to tell, they were for, obviously the Democratic Party was running the county and running the state, but they were for anybody they could buy. And it really didn't matter who they were or what they were. Hoyt Shepherd, the kingpin I mentioned, is the only one that I found any, and it's really just from oral histories. I don't have any documentation of this, but that the only one that I have any indication was in the Klan, and he made no secret about that. But people were more afraid of him because he was Hoyt Shepherd, the kingpin, than because of his Klan activities. And some of you may know this, but Albert Patterson, who was murdered, his son was John Patterson, who became the governor of Alabama. I've interviewed him a couple of times about this. He's 90, he'll be 94, I believe, in September. And he says he has a vivid memory as a little boy of watching the Klan parade, and he said, well, you could tell who everybody was. It was a small town, and you knew their shoes. So, so he said, you know, I would see him marching in the parades, and everybody knew that he was in the Klan. But you know, as far as this sort of my bigger question about sort of what does it mean to have this white mob exercising this kind of local control, I don't think they were doing anything, I haven't been able to determine so far anyway, that they're doing anything out of the ordinary or anything different than what was happening anywhere else. They would occasionally, when they needed to rig an election, they would try to exploit and manipulate the black vote in Russell County and go pay people to come in and vote who otherwise would not have been allowed to vote in elections. There was some of that going on. But I haven't even been able to determine that that was the way they got the elections fixed. I don't think they had to. The election that they almost stole away from Albert Patterson for the Democratic primary to become the new Attorney General, they just went in and erased the election returns and wrote in the numbers that they wanted. So they didn't even go so far as to try to pay people to vote. And when Patterson, they already were upset with him because he had this crime-fighting reputation, and he was promising that one of the first things he was going to do when he was elected was clean up Phoenix City. So they're upset about that, but the immediate thing that got him killed is that he knew they had changed the returns. He had gotten his hands on some of them, and he was going to testify before the grand jury in Montgomery the following week, and they knew it, and they had to stop him from doing that. So.
By the way, I'm from Alabama.
Are you, where? Where? I grew up right on the Alabama line. Where in Alabama?
Small town called Parrish, about 35 miles west of Birmingham.
Okay, all right.
Well, Tammy, thank you very much.
Thank
An
you.
extraordinarily interesting presentation, and thank you for telling us so much about the Kefauver investigation records. And it's quite clear that they're a rewarding project for your book, and you're off to a wonderful start, and we're glad to hear about the next phase, and we look forward to having you back someday.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.